When we all first entered the realm of Shadow, we didn't know what to expect. The land in front of us was vast, with a tall giant in the background. There was a castle that looked mysterious, a towering keep in the distance where an intriguing story could take place. The tree in the distance gave us a different feeling, knowing we were playing Elden Ring but in a totally different place. We weren't supposed to fight the first mini-boss either, and with that, a familiar memory took place. The time when we walked into the first steps of Limgrave, only for the Tree Sentinel boss to put us in our place and show us what Souls games are really about. There was no easy mode here. Limgrave was immediately filled with challenges and lore hidden in every detail, but yet for many players, the game somehow felt perfectly balanced. You could level up and get ahead, or go at a boss at a lower level to show off your skills. No matter what you did, you could always fall back on leveling up with runes to be one step ahead. Deep below Limgrave, there was the beautiful Shifa River, the first location that had me stunned at Elden Ring's detail. I remember the first night of playing the game I ended up there, only to be stuck looking around at the somehow amazing sky below the surface. The area was shocking, and yet it was just a small piece of Elden Ring's massive map, because at first you may think it's just Limgrave and maybe Caelid. This was only the beginning of our journey, which would be the first of many. After beating Elden Ring's base game over 100 times, now 2100 hours in, I had found my favorite game. Never has it been this easy to spend so much time on a single game. It had everything: tough bosses, cool lore, amazing locations, and a new challenge at every corner. 2 years and change later, the DLC would finally release, and how could it possibly live up to the base game? Was the bar set too high? The first issue that Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree would run into was twofold, because they're essentially part of the same thing. The time between the game's initial release and the DLC, as well as how good and balanced the base game was. This led to a very high bar, with a long production time, as well as trying to live up to boss fights like Melania, Placidusa, Malakath, Godfrey, and more. The original game took around 4 years to make, so we assumed 2, since they already had the basic functions of Elden Ring done, would give them time to do something on a massive scale. And as June 2024 came around, the DLC was finally released. The reviews from major gaming outlets were in. This was a 10 out of 10 game, nearly perfect in every aspect. The map was huge for a DLC, and it offered content that was bigger than most single players games are in their entirety. But there was something looming in the distance, some major flaw that the game had, a flaw that I didn't even notice until I'd completely beaten the DLC. The game's replay value. Before diving deep into spoilers and talking about the boss fights, which will appear late in the video, let's talk about the 95 new weapons Shadow of the Erdtree has to offer. This number is incredibly deceiving. Out of the 95 weapons, and at this point I've used at least 2/3 of them, maybe even 3/4 of them, there are less than 10 that are viable to fight the incredibly challenging DLC bosses for an average Souls player. Many people will tell you there's only a handful. Weapons like the Anvil Hammer, Bloodfiend's Arm, Milady, Backhand Blades, and the Fire Knight's Greatsword are examples. There's probably a few more, but overall, after that, there's an incredible gap. Everything else does less damage than most base game weapons to the DLC bosses. And that leads to our second issue with the 95 new weapons Shadow of the Erdtree offers. Base game weapons are still king, so you'd think this isn't a huge deal, but there's a significant difference between the base game weapons and the DLC weapons. Here's an example. Take any curved sword or twin blade with Blood Affinity or Occult Seppuku, and you're netting more damage than almost every DLC weapons in terms of pure DPS. Yes, bleed is broken, and the Thorn Sorceries are one of the few new ways to expand upon that in DLC. However, there's not just one single comparison to be made here. Which leads us to our next section. It's time to talk about YouTube comments, because they're really important for context in this video. This is going to lead directly to our next section, where we're going to talk about what people used for the DLC. I've seen an innumerable amount of comments on my channel of players running through the whole DLC with the Blasphemous Blade. One weapon, spamming a single Ash of War to move through the difficult bosses in the DLC, because they're simply not able to survive or sustain the boss fights, particularly on New Game Plus and beyond. New Game Plus 7 players had the most difficulty, with boss scaling being very high in terms of damage output and HP, and with the new upgrade system and balancing check, high-level players would still struggle to get through the DLC. But there lies an underlying issue. How could one game give us so many cool-looking weapons and Ashes of War, just for a good amount of people to rely on base game weapons? Sure, the Blasphemous Blade is still king, and it's just as reliable in the base game, but players were fighting base game bosses with an assortment of weapons, from bleed builds, powerful mage and faith builds, and even cool dexterity and bonk strength builds. In Shadow of the Erdtree though, many players were using faith or a shield poke build. This ultimately limited how players would face each boss, thus impacting their motivation to go through the DLC again. This limited style is what we're talking about a bit more now with the bosses in the DLC. Spoilers for bosses are going to be beyond this point, so beware. Bosses are notably difficult in Shadow of the Erdtree, and they're meant to be, but so is the endgame stretch of bosses in the base game as well as Millennia. The difference here is that the final boss in the base game is manageable with build variety for most. The DLC bosses force many players into specific playstyles. Commander Gaius, which is my least favorite boss of the DLC, has attacks with little wind-up time and a charge that can somehow 3-hit you with invisible hitboxes on his sides. This means most players will either bring a shield, use summons, or cheese the boss to get through it. I've heard this boss has taken players hours, and in some cases more than the final boss, who we'll discuss here shortly. Midra and Mesmer are excellent, and I'll show them quickly here. Both bosses are well balanced with amazing moves and unique environments. But then we have Baal, who for some reason has no lock-on for his back or tail, meaning you either can't see his attacks or you're stuck facing him in the front. This usually means the best bet is to go directly under him and use large target shredders like Pest Thread Spears and Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike. His large size makes the camera difficult at times too, especially when making the decision to lock onto him or not. Placid Usex, by comparison, is much easier to front face or predict below him. The Scattertree avatar is incredibly weak to fire, and from what I've heard, a lot of people used fire and faith builds to take him on. This is common with the tree avatars, but you'll notice that his damage with fire is too big of a difference to use much else on him. Mother of Fingers was a fight I enjoyed, and I've been reading comments that people are actually getting stuck on her due to her large size and hard-hitting combos, particularly on New Game Plus and beyond. All DLC bosses have relatively high health pools, even on the base New Game, which makes New Game Plus 3 specifically and later have significant bloat. The only exception would be Divine Beast, who has lower HP than most other bosses. He has zero resistance to fire though, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people also use the Blasphemous Blade here too, although this boss isn't overly difficult. We also have the Hippo, although after his hitbox was fixed for the bite, he's fairly easy. He's also in water. The next one I want to mention, because I'm not going over all the bosses here, and honestly I love their designs and most of their movesets, is Concert Radahn. First of all, I'm still confused on the lore here, but that's okay. It was fan service at its finest. There's a lot of people around launch time wondering what Prime Radahn would be like, and guess what? We found out. Concert Radahn is an absolute spectacle, a mashup of incredibly fast combos and high damage heavier attacks. This one can be done in a matter of playstyles, but Phase 2 is what we need to talk about. There's a few options. The first two involve being an amazing Souls player, beating Radahn through perfectly timed dodges or parrying. This is probably not most of Elden Ring's players though. Phase 2 is the perfect example of forcing a certain playstyle, shield poke. Yep, other than the thorns, which I still believe may be balanced at some point, the other viable option is shield poke. This fight just simply asks for too much from the player. If you're not perfect in your dodges, you could easily get roll caught into a combo, and you'll be back trying again afterwards. I know Radahn's Phase 2 with Miquella is supposed to be absolutely insane, and it is, but the fight was so difficult for most players that they are likely hesitant to go back and take on Radahn again with a different build. Very true problem with most of Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses. Phenomenal designs, amazing movesets, and cool backgrounds, yet they seem to be missing one fundamental thing, remembering you can have fun in a Souls game. This is very much what some may consider a fan letter to From Software, and it's done with love of the game. There's a ton of good and great things here. The DLC scope and scenery is amazing. The boss designs, -1, are incredible. The feeling of beating these bosses is the best there is, as they're the ultimate Souls test. The amount of effort here, you can't even compare most other single-player games to Elden Ring or its DLC. It's a 10 out of 10 because nothing else even comes close. But the problem is when you compare a masterpiece of a base game with the DLC, and maybe making that comparison is unfair, a bar possibly set too high to hit, one that would involve nothing short of perfection. And Elden Ring's DLC comes damn near close, doing everything we've asked for and somehow more. My final review for the DLC, despite going over the issues with replay value related to weaker weapons and boss HP and damage bloat, is still a complete 10 out of 10. This is so close to perfect, only being short of it simply by overtuning bosses and undertuning weapons, but both things can be fixed in a patch or an update. 10 out of 10 is spot on here, and I haven't changed my opinions on that even with the replayability issues. Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree is a phenomenal game. And of course, single-player games can't last forever, and Elden Ring isn't an exception in terms of maintaining its player base for years to come. It's not supposed to. This isn't Destiny or Call of Duty, and the value is in the single-player part of the game. Rarely ever do I hear someone say they bought Elden Ring for PvP alone. They play PvP, but likely bought it to experience one of the best games of the generation, and that, with time, will fade naturally. Elden Ring was originally supposed to have 2 DLCs, but instead we ended up with one massive DLC. The story, as far as Elden Ring goes, is over until Elden Ring 2. Let's only hope that when that time comes, they learn they now have a much larger player base, one that has players of all types wanting to use various builds to take down the toughest bosses the game has to offer. This is truly a phenomenal DLC, and if you're finding yourself hesitant to replay it, comment below and let me know what you think. Let's also hope next time we get achievements or trophies. Although that's not an issue for me since I rarely pay attention to them, it seems like an obvious missed feature the DLC should have had. This video was made for my own opinions, as well as polls, comments, and a generalization of some of the issues the DLC has had so far. If you're stuck, keep at it, and don't be afraid to use summons either. I have a solo strategy guide for all Remembrance bosses linked below, in the description. I'll also be covering Black Myth Wukong upon release because it's a challenging Souls-like I feel like that fits the genre of this channel, and I'm also going to start expanding to other games that are challenging as well. I like challenging games and RPGs overall, and I'm going to start checking out other games too. Of course, I love Elden Ring, and I'm going to be covering more builds, making more builds, and having a lot more fun with the DLC. There are more future runs for the DLC for me, no question. I just hope a patch or update fixes some of the game's issues, particularly with making the weapons better. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.